Welcome, traveler of time. Come closer, rest your weary thoughts, and allow me to guide you through a tale long buried beneath the dust of forgotten chronicles. Tonight, beneath the soft veil of whisper and shadow, we journey back to an age of splendor and strife, a time when the world trembled under the weight of empires, and whispers of ambition echoed in the marble halls of Istanbul. The year is 1683. The Ottoman Empire stands vast and proud, its banners fluttering like golden flames over 3 continents. From the shimmering domes of Constantinople to the windswept deserts of Arabia, its power flows like a mighty river. Yet even the greatest rivers must one day meet resistance. At the gates of Vienna, the empire reached the height of its ambition and the beginning of its reckoning. This is not merely the tale of a siege. No, my dear listener, this is the tale of what came after, of secret councils held by candlelight, of veiled strategies carved in silence, where one defeat masked the unfolding of a deeper, darker design. For even as the Ottoman tide receded from the fields of Vienna, another current began to stir, one not of conquest but of cunning. Let your mind be still now. Imagine the cool marble of the imperial chambers, the scent of rosewater lingering in the air, and the distant call to prayer echoing like a ghost through the morning mist. The Sultan's viziers gather, their robes whispering secrets as they move. The grand empire, wounded yet breathing, begins to plan not in shouts, but in whispers. And what were these whispers? What plans took shape in the silence that followed defeat? That, my dear listener, is where our story truly begins. And like all great stories, it starts not with answers, but with a question wrapped in shadow. Let us return to where the air was thick with prophecy, and the future balanced on the edge of a sword. Come now, let me take you back to the world before Vienna fell. Now that you've settled in, let me take you further back. Before the thundering hooves reached the plains outside Vienna, before banners were raised and blades were drawn, there was a world quietly bracing itself, a world on the edge, its great powers watching one another with suspicion, wrapped in ceremony and ambitions cloaked in velvet and iron. The year was not yet 1683, but the winds were already shifting. The Ottoman Empire, by then, was no stranger to war. It had thundered through the Balkans and swept across North Africa like a storm given flesh. From the spires of Belgrade to the ancient shores of Crete, the sultans had stretched their dominion over lands rich with gold, grain, and glory. But what mattered most was not the land itself. It was the rhythm of power. The Ottomans were masterful in their dance of expansion, slow when the world grew wary, swift when it grew weak. They called it fetih, conquest, but to them it was something grander. It was destiny. A sacred thread drawn from the prophet's banner, woven into the very soul of their empire. In Istanbul, the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and old parchment. Beneath the great dome of the Topkapi Palace, men in long robes murmured in shadowed corridors, their voices low but urgent. The empire's ruler, Sultan Mehmed IV, was a man more fond of the hunt than the council chamber. He left much in the hands of his grand vizier, Kara Mustafa Pasha. Now he was the flame behind the plan, a tall man with piercing eyes and a mind sharpened by both pride and pressure. He believed that the time had come to take Europe by the throat, to make the old dream real again, not just to conquer land, but to break the Habsburgs, to take Vienna, and across the continent. In the stone-cold halls of Vienna, there was a very different kind of quiet. Emperor Leopold I, reserved, devout, and awkward in courtly speech, felt the weight of something coming, though he couldn't yet name it. The Habsburgs had been watching the East for years, their fingers tightening around the borders, fortifying towns, training men. They were weary of the Ottomans, yes, but more than that, they feared them. The memory of past defeats lingered in their bones. The idea that perhaps this time the Turks wouldn't stop, that maybe this time they wouldn't turn back. But it wasn't just these two powers playing their parts. No, the chessboard was far more crowded than that. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the Republic of Venice, the Tsardom of Russia, and the countless German states, all of them shifting and turning, forging alliances one day, betraying them the next. Europe was not united. It was a patchwork of rivalries stitched together by need and convenience, not loyalty. And in this chaos, Kara Mustafa saw an opening. Still, the path ahead wasn't clear. Even among the Ottomans, there were voices that whispered doubt. The Janissaries, once fearsome and loyal, had grown restless. Court intrigues, shifting loyalties, and the slow rust of an empire past its prime. These things hummed beneath the surface. But none of that stopped Kara Mustafa. He saw something grander than the skeptics did. In his dreams, he marched through the gates of Vienna, not as a conqueror, but as a messenger of fate. In his mind, the West would kneel, and history would change its course. And so preparations began, slowly at first like a great beast waking from slumber. Soldiers drilled in the fields of Edirne. Cannons were cast, polished until they gleamed like ominous jewels. Maps were drawn, debated, redrawn. And letters, oh, so many letters, were carried across the empire by riders cloaked in dusk. They spoke of logistics, of supply routes, of timing, but between the lines, they carried something else. A hunger, a vision, a secret belief that perhaps, just perhaps, Europe was ripe for the taking. You see, by the time spring crept into the air, the world was already leaning toward what would become one of the most pivotal moments in its long, tired story. The empires knew it. The generals felt it in their bones. And the common folk, well, they simply prayed. For peace, for rain, for safety. And yet, as these great forces moved quietly into place, something else began to stir. Not in the courts or on the maps, but within the hearts of those who would soon face each other on the fields of destiny. But we'll get to that soon enough. For now, keep this image close. A world filled with tension, like a bowstring drawn tight, waiting, just waiting for the hand to release it. Ah, the winds carried a different weight that year. The summer of 1683 arrived heavy and expectant, like the moment before a storm breaks. Across the fields and forests that spread like a tapestry between Istanbul and Vienna, something vast was moving. Slow, purposeful, unstoppable. The great Ottoman army, a force of nearly 150,000 souls, advanced with the rhythm of an ancient drumbeat, steady and solemn. They came from every corner of the empire, janissaries in sharp formation, cavalry gliding over dust-choked roads, camel trains packed with food, weapons, and dreams of conquest. Above them, the crescent standard of the Sultan caught the sunlight, fluttering against a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Kara Mustafa Pasha, riding near the front of this tide, barely spoke. His thoughts were inward, pressed into silence by the weight of what was to come. He had staked his entire being on this moment. Vienna was not just another city. No, it was the gateway to Western Europe, the gleaming lock on a door he intended to break wide open. He believed history itself had chosen him to complete what past sultans could not, to fulfill a vision nearly 2 centuries in the making. But ambition, ambition always travels with a shadow. When the Ottomans reached Vienna in early July, the city was already bracing for a siege. Emperor Leopold had fled to safety, but not before leaving behind a garrison under Count Ernst Rudiger von Starhemberg, a man of steely will and bone-deep loyalty. The people of Vienna, sensing the gravity of what was coming, didn't panic. They built, they fortified, they prayed. And when the Ottoman guns finally opened fire, shaking the earth with thunder, the defenders knew this would be a test not only of walls and weapons, but of spirit. The siege itself unfolded like a slow tightening of breath. Day after day, the Ottomans inched forward, digging trenches, setting up batteries, battering the outer defenses. At night, the Viennese would creep into the darkness to sabotage what they could, returning with hands raw and eyes wide. The city pulsed like a living heart, bruised but beating, as men and women alike worked side by side. The air reeked of sweat, smoke, and gunpowder. Above it all, the ringing of church bells, faint but defiant, echoed like a promise in the ash-colored sky. Kara Mustafa, for all his might, faced more than just stone walls. Inside his own camp, whispers had begun. Some commanders questioned his choices. Why delay? Why not strike harder, faster? Others warned of an approaching coalition forming in the west, led by the Polish king Jan Sobieski. But the Grand Vizier refused to retreat, refused to doubt. "The gates will open," he said, his voice low and unshaking. "And when they do, the empire will rise anew." But destiny, as I've learned in my many years, rarely bows to will alone. On the morning of September 12th, as a pale mist hung low over the hills outside Vienna, the horizon stirred. The Allied army had arrived. Polish, Austrian, and German troops surged down the Kahlenberg heights, a wave of steel and banners with King Sobieski at the helm, his winged hussars thundering forward like something out of legend. The battle that followed was fierce and chaotic, a clash of titanic force that shattered the siege line and sent the Ottomans reeling. Kara Mustafa watched as the dream unraveled, as months of planning, years of longing fell away in the space of a single day. He did not scream, he did not weep. He ordered the retreat with the same calm he'd once used to plot conquest, but behind his eyes something had fractured. The silence that followed the siege was heavier than the cannon smoke left behind. Vienna stood, scarred, weary, but unbroken. The bells rang again, louder this time, and the people wept, not in fear, but in relief. For them it was victory, for the Ottomans a turning point, and for Kara Mustafa Ba a burden he would carry to his grave. But even as the dust settled and the armies withdrew, something strange lingered. Not all plans had perished in Vienna. In fact, some had just begun to take shape, whispered not on the battlefield, but in the shadows that followed. And those are the stories history almost forgot. I remember them, and if you stay close, I'll tell you what happened after the siege, when the swords were sheathed and the real games began. But now we must turn our gaze to the east once more, to the sprawling city of Istanbul, where the faint whispers of the Bosphorus are mingled with the clang of steel and the rustling of silk. It was here, in the shadow of the great palace that overlooked the city like a sleeping giant, that the echoes of Vienna's defeat reverberated most loudly. The echoes were not of triumph nor of glory, but of something far more painful, a humbling that would find its way into the very heart of the empire. When news of the failed siege reached Istanbul, it arrived like a thunderclap, startling the city from its complacency. One moment the streets had been alive with the buzz of anticipation, as if the Sultan's dream of reclaiming the West was within their grasp. The next, silence. The palace, usually bustling with the sounds of courtiers and advisors, fell into an uneasy quiet. The high marble walls of the Topkapi Palace stood still, as if even the very stones sensed the weight of what had just transpired. Inside the palace, Sultan Mehmed IV sat at the High Council, his face pale, the weight of the news pressing down on him like an iron weight. Kara Mustafa, his most trusted vizier, the man who had been the architect of this grand vision, stood before him, head bowed, eyes downcast. The great military leader who had once filled the room with the confidence of a man who knew he would succeed, now looked a shadow of his former self. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any words could. "What now?" Sultan Mehmed asked, his voice betraying a hint of fear. Fear not of the enemy, but of the fractured pride of the empire. Kara Mustafa, though weary from months of effort and strain, lifted his gaze and spoke softly, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "The dream has shattered, my Sultan. We must learn to live with its broken pieces." His voice trembled with the weight of the failure, but there was no anger, no fire in him now, only the quiet resignation of a man who had staked everything on a single outcome and lost. The council room fell silent, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The palace's vast hallways felt emptier now, quieter, distant murmurs of unease drifting through the stone corridors. In the streets below, the people did not yet know the full extent of their loss, but the rumblings of defeat were already rippling through the city. Merchants, soldiers, scholars, all caught in the undertow of a collective dread. For years, the Ottomans had been the unstoppable force, their reach stretching further with each passing year. But now, in the space of a single battle, their pride had been pierced, and the reverberations were felt by everyone, from the Grand Vizier to the humble worker in the bazaar. In the days that followed, rumors spread like wildfire, whispers of blame. Kara Mustafa, once a hero in the eyes of many, was now a scapegoat in the making. There were murmurs in the shadowed corners of the palace, in the salons and baths, that the vizier's ambition had led them too far. Perhaps he had overreached. Perhaps he had misjudged the power of Vienna's walls, the strength of its defender. The question of whether the decision to continue the siege had been wise haunted the halls of the empire, as much as it haunted Kara Mustafa's own heart. The Sultan, uncertain of his next steps, turned inward. There was talk of replacing the vizier, of finding a new path forward, but those who sought to gain favor by advocating for his downfall were playing dangerous games. The political landscape was a delicate web, where power shifted on the smallest of winds. In the shadows, the intrigue grew thick, and every whisper of dissatisfaction, every complaint, seemed to fuel the fire of discontent. Yet even amidst the political chaos, one truth remained undeniable. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut it once had been. The defeat at Vienna had cracked the facade. Where once there had been the belief that the Ottomans could simply march across Europe and take what they desired, now there was a deep uncertainty. Could they still maintain their grip on the lands they had already conquered? Could they defend the integrity of the empire? Or had the dream of an Ottoman Europe already begun to fade like mist in the morning sun? And through it all, Kara Mustafa remained, if not a figure of power, then at least a figure of regret. No longer trusted as he once had been, yet still too deeply entwined in the empire's fate to simply walk away. He lingered in the palace, his thoughts heavy with what could have been, knowing full well that the empire's future would be shaped by the choices of those who came after him. But the story of Kara Mustafa doesn't end here, not by a long shot. As the empire contemplates its next moves, the stage is being set for a series of decisions that will either restore their pride or push them further into decline. In the coming days, whispers of his fate will circle through the halls of power, and the political landscape of the empire will shift once again. But I'll save those whispers for later. For now, remember, in the heart of every empire, there are moments where the threads of destiny are pulled taut, and all it takes is a single mistake, a single misstep to unravel it all. The winds of change had swept through the empire like a summer storm, leaving behind a trail of confusion and uncertainty. The Sultan's once unshakable confidence had been rattled by the disastrous defeat at Vienna, and now the high halls of power in Istanbul were heavy with whispers, their very walls a witness to the deep unease that had settled over the Ottoman heart. The grandeur of the empire, which had once seemed an indomitable force, now felt fragile, as if the very foundation upon which it was built had begun to erode. In the wake of this calamitous event, the Sultan, Mehmed IV, found himself grappling not only with the loss of a key battle, but also with the weight of his empire's future. The air in the Topkapi Palace seemed thicker now, heavy with the anxiety of courtiers who had once seen themselves as the agents of an eternal empire. Each day seemed to bring a new challenge, new questions of loyalty, of direction, of purpose. For the first time in many years, the Ottoman leadership found itself in a vulnerable position, not from an outside enemy, but from the weight of its own failures. It was clear that something needed to change, something deep, something fundamental. The old ways, the old leadership structures, no longer seemed to hold the same strength. But change, as it always does, came slowly. Leaders, after all, are rarely quick to abandon the systems that have long served them. Yet after Vienna, there could be no denying the need for reform. The first sign of this came in the form of Kara Mustafa's fall from grace. Once the Grand Vizier who held the empire's fortunes in his hands, his failure became both a personal and political disaster. His ambition, once seen as the driving force behind the empire's westward push, was now viewed with suspicion. His removal was not just the Sultan's decision, but a decision made by a court that had grown weary of his overreach. Kara Mustafa was replaced by a man whose name did not carry the same weight, whose reputation had not been so closely tied to the failed siege. This was not simply a shift in leadership, it was a statement. The Ottoman Empire needed to recalibrate. The old ambitions, the unyielding desires for conquest, needed to be tempered with something new: humility, reflection, and the willingness to change. Yet even as the vizier's position changed hands, the very concept of leadership itself was under scrutiny. The palace officials, who had once been so accustomed to unquestioning loyalty, now found themselves in the midst of a more complicated political landscape. Gone were the days when the Sultan's word was taken as law, when his will was the final answer. Now whispers in the halls spoke of factions, rivalries, and the slow crumbling of once formidable power structures. The very nature of the empire's leadership was in flux. But it wasn't just political leadership that needed reform. There were also deeper structural shifts needed within the empire's military. For too long, the Ottoman army had been seen as an unstoppable force, a well-oiled machine that could crush any opposition. But Vienna had exposed the flaws in that system. The Janissaries, once the pride of the empire, had grown complacent. Their discipline had faltered, their loyalty questioned. There were murmurs of corruption, of men more interested in their own gains than the glory of the empire. And so the leadership, in an attempt to patch the cracks in their armor, began to turn its focus inward. Military reforms were proposed, changes in tactics, new training regimens, and a renewed focus on discipline and loyalty. But there was a catch. Reforms, no matter how necessary, are rarely welcomed by those in power, and the Janissaries, accustomed to their privileges, were not eager to relinquish them. Change would not come easily. It was in this atmosphere of political upheaval and military introspection that the empire began to take its first tentative steps toward self-preservation. The reforms, though slow and painful, began to take root. New officials were brought in, men who had been waiting in the wings for an opportunity to prove themselves. These were not the men of the past, men who had known only conquest and expansion. These were men who saw the world with new eyes, who understood that the empire needed to adapt or risk becoming a relic of the past. The echoes of Vienna's defeat had not faded, but in the quiet, shadowed corners of Istanbul, where the soft scent of spices mingled with the distant hum of the Bosphorus, something else was being born. It was not an empire ready to charge forward once more, as it had done in years past, but an empire on the cusp of reflection. The old ways had failed them, and now they had to learn to navigate the storm. The steps they took now, no matter how small, would determine whether the empire would rise again or slip quietly into the annals of history. As the whispers in the palace grew, one thing was clear: the Ottoman Empire was at a crossroads. The old ways had not served them well, and now it was time to carve a new path, one that would either restore their former glory or push them into an era of decline. But one question still lingered, unanswered in the hearts of those in power. Who, truly, would lead them into this uncertain future? And as the new leadership began to take shape, the storm clouds of uncertainty gathered on the horizon. What would come next for the empire? Would the reforms succeed, or would they only delay the inevitable? Only time would tell, but the changes were coming, whether the empire was ready or not. In the cool, stone-walled chambers of the divan, where the air was thick with the scent of ink and wax, The murmur of whispered voices had begun to grow louder. The walls, which had long been the silent witnesses to Ottoman triumphs, now stood as quiet observers to a moment of deep uncertainty. The defeat at Vienna had left the empire wounded, but it had also stirred something else within the minds of those who still held sway over the future of the empire. A new strategy was beginning to take shape. Not one born out of the old dreams of relentless conquest, but one forged in the fires of reflection and the harsh lessons of failure. Sitting around the divan, the imperial council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the weight of responsibility pressing down on them like the humidity of a summer afternoon. It was in these chambers that the future would be decided, and yet the path forward seemed as elusive as the distant horizon. Sultan Mehmed IV, his once vibrant gaze now shadowed with the burden of defeat, listened intently to the voices of his viziers and advisors. Their words came slowly, measured, as if each one were a careful step in a land still unfamiliar to them. "Perhaps," began one of the more cautious voices, "it is time to reconsider our ambitions. The West is no longer the simple frontier it once was. The powers we once looked down upon are now formidable in their own right. Perhaps we should turn our eyes inward, toward the heart of our empire." The idea hung in the air like a delicate thread, unspoken but understood by all who were present, the heart of the empire. Could that be the answer? After all, for so long the Ottomans had focused their energies outward, seeking new lands, new conquests. The grand dream of expansion had been ingrained in their very identity, but now, in the wake of Vienna, the realization had settled in. The empire could no longer afford to spread itself thin, stretching its resources and its soldiers too far across the map. Another voice, younger and more impetuous, spoke with a certain fervor. "We cannot simply retreat from the West. The world sees us as a fading power now. If we do not act boldly, we will lose not just land but respect. The old strategy must be maintained, strength through expansion." The tension between the two camps, those who sought to consolidate and those who urged for renewed aggression, was palpable. It was clear that this would be no easy decision. For the first time, the divan was not just debating military tactics, but something far deeper. The very soul of the empire. What did it mean to be Ottoman in the aftermath of Vienna? Could the empire continue to survive by relying on the same methods that had served it in the past, or was something new required? As the debate swirled around the table, Sultan Mehmed IV leaned back in his chair, his mind racing through the possibilities. He had been a ruler who had long admired the grandeur of his empire's past, the fierce warriors who had once swept across Europe like a tidal wave. But he could not deny the growing sense of doubt within him. Had the time for expansion passed? Could the empire stand firm without conquering more lands? Or was there another way to preserve its strength? The light in the room flickered faintly as a breeze whispered through the open window, carrying with it the distant sounds of Istanbul. An ever-changing city, one foot still in the past, the other stretching forward into an uncertain future. The empire was at a crossroads, and the whispers in the divan were only the beginning. The new strategy would need to be more than a simple shift in direction. It would require a reevaluation of everything the Ottomans had stood for. It was no longer just about military might, it was about adapting, surviving, and finding a way to preserve what remained. As the hours passed and the voices continued to rise and fall in heated discussion, a sense of quiet resolve began to settle over the group. The empire's future, fragile as it was, would not be built on the same grand dreams that had led to the Siege of Vienna. Instead, it would be a future born out of patience, reflection, and careful calculation. A future where the Ottomans could look inward and rebuild what had been lost, while still holding on to the remnants of their glory. And yet, even as they spoke of consolidation, the shadow of their defeat loomed large. The new strategy would not be easy. The changes they were contemplating would stir unrest in the ranks, among the soldiers who had been trained for conquest, among the people who had once seen themselves as part of an empire on the move. How would they respond to this new direction? Would the military, once a symbol of Ottoman power, accept a future that did not involve further expansion? The questions remained unanswered, hanging in the air like the faint echo of a distant battle horn. There was no clear path, no easy solution. The empire had tasted defeat, and now it had to learn how to live with that reality. But one thing was certain: the days of reckless conquest were over. The empire would survive, but it would need to evolve. As the last of the debate faded into the night, the leaders of the empire knew that the future would not be shaped by the battles they fought in faraway lands, but by the strength they could find within themselves. And so, the whispers in the divan continued. They were no longer whispers of ambition, but of survival. And with survival came a new kind of power, one that would require them to be more than just warriors. It would demand that they become something else entirely. What that would be, only time could tell. As the Ottomans sat in the long shadow of their defeat at Vienna, the great wheels of the empire began to turn in a direction many had never anticipated. For centuries, their gaze had been fixed upon the West, the glittering, tempting lands of Europe, full of both riches and challenges. But now, amidst the echoes of failure and the shifting tides of fortune, a different horizon began to catch the eye of the empire's leaders. They had long been accustomed to battling the West, but the East, Persia in particular, had always remained just beyond their full grasp. Could this vast land, rich in ancient history and opulent treasures, offer the Ottomans a new path to glory? In the dimly lit chambers of the palace, the air was thick with the scent of spices and parchment. Sultan Mehmed IV, his brow furrowed from the weight of recent events, sat at the head of a long table where his closest advisors gathered. The room hummed with quiet conversation, the flickering light from oil lamps casting long shadows on the walls. A low murmur of strategy filled the space as the council members debated the direction the empire would take in the wake of their failed campaign in the West. A seasoned vizier, known for his sharp mind and more cautious nature, broke the silence. "Perhaps it is time we turn our attention eastward," he proposed. His voice was measured but filled with a quiet conviction, as if he had already lived through the consequences of previous choices. Persia has long been a thorn in our side, and the rise of the Safavids has created an opportunity. Our eastern borders have grown unstable. Why not focus our efforts on securing our realm there? We could not only reassert our dominance, but also shift the balance of power in the region. The suggestion lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of its implications. The Safavid Empire, led by the determined and ambitious Shah, had long been a rival of the Ottomans. But their power was not yet as entrenched as the Western kingdoms the Ottomans had once sought to conquer. To turn their attention to Persia meant engaging in a different kind of war. A war not of Europe's cities and fortresses, but of vast deserts, mountainous landscapes, and ancient empires whose history stretched back millennia. One of the younger voices in the room, a man still untested by the harsh realities of leadership, leaned forward eagerly. "If we do this," he said, his eyes alight with the fire of youthful ambition, "we could secure the rich trade routes to the east. Persia holds the keys to the Silk Road, the treasures of India, and the wealth of the Far East. With control over that region, we could expand not just our borders, but our influence over the entire continent." His words were met with a mixture of skepticism and intrigue. There was no denying the allure of Persia's wealth and its strategic importance. The route to India, so vital for trade and prestige, lay open before them. Yet there were complications too. The land was harsh, the terrain unforgiving, and the people of Persia had proven themselves resilient. The Ottomans had long struggled to gain a firm hold in the region. The challenges were many, and the risks undeniable. Sultan Mehmed IV remained silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the arm of his chair as he weighed the proposal. His mind drifted not to the glory of past conquests, but to the lessons learned from Vienna. The West had changed. Had he too changed? Could the same strategies that had once brought the empire success still be applied to a very different kind of war? The room held its breath as the Sultan finally spoke, his voice low and deliberate. Perhaps it is time we shift our gaze. Perhaps the West is no longer the prize it once was. His words sent a ripple of surprise through the room. The Persians too are our rivals, but perhaps in the East there is a different kind of strength we must understand, a more subtle kind of power. The decision to refocus on Persia was not a small one. It would involve rethinking the empire's approach to war, to diplomacy, and to trade. It would require a new kind of leadership, one that was willing to adapt to the changing dynamics of the world. And yet, in the heart of Istanbul, beneath the shadows of minarets and the quiet hum of the Bosphorus, the seeds of a new plan were being sown. The Sultan's decision was not just about Persia, it was about redefining the Ottoman Empire's place in the world. The East was a world apart from the West. It was a world of different cultures, different ways of thinking, and different opportunities. The Ottomans would need to embrace that world not with the same ambitions that had fueled their rise in Europe, but with a deeper understanding of the intricacies of the region. But as the debate continued and plans were laid, there was a sense of uncertainty in the room. The road to Persia was not without its dangers. The Safavids were a fierce enemy, and the journey there was fraught with peril. Still, the prospect of redirecting the empire's energies towards a new and uncharted land was a powerful one. As the evening wore on and the plans took shape, one question lingered in the minds of all present. Would this eastern diversion be the answer the empire so desperately needed, or would it lead them down yet another path of endless struggle? Only time would tell, but the first steps had been taken, and with them, the empire's future seemed to shift ever so slightly in a new direction. The whispers of Persia, of mountains and deserts, of the Silk Road and ancient cities, began to echo in the halls of the palace, promising a future that was still uncertain, but one that was full of possibility. What awaited the Ottomans in the East? That, dear listener, is a story for another time. The night was thick with tension as the cold winds of Europe swept across the land. But inside the high marble halls of the Topkapi Palace, the quiet murmur of intrigue began to stir. The grand tapestries on the walls fluttered slightly in the breeze from the open windows, their images of past glories now contrasted by the quiet tension that had settled upon the empire. The dust of defeat still hung in the air after Vienna, but the Ottomans had not abandoned. No, they would not let the West slip through their fingers so easily. It was a time when shadows played as much a role in shaping the future as swords did. If you asked the courtiers at the palace, they might tell you that the real battles weren't being fought with cannonballs and swords, but rather with whispers, secrets, and shadows. In this world of silent games, the Sultan and his closest advisors knew the importance of gathering intelligence and weaving webs of influence in foreign courts. Espionage and diplomacy were the hidden swords of the empire, sharp and deadly, and they wielded them with expertise, knowing that their greatest weapon lay not in what was visible, but in what was unseen. One such mission began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A lone messenger, wrapped in the thick cloak of anonymity, was dispatched from Istanbul to the far reaches of Europe. This man, an unremarkable figure on the surface, carried the weight of his sultan's will. His mission was clear: to gather secrets, to listen where others dared not, and to make alliances in places where none were expected. He would become the eyes and ears of the empire, slipping in and out of European capitals without a trace, leaving behind only the whisper of his presence. His journey took him first to Venice, where the canals glistened under the morning sun and the scent of salt water mixed with the fragrance of fresh pastries from the bakeries. But the Venetian nobility, with their silk robes and jeweled fingers, were no strangers to the intrigues of the world. He knew his mission here would not be an easy one. He would have to walk among them, play their games, and gain their trust. Yet, beneath the opulent exterior of this city, there was a restless undercurrent, a quiet fear of the Ottomans, an empire whose strength and reach extended far beyond their borders. In a small candlelit tavern near the Rialto Bridge, our man met with his first contact, a diplomat in disguise. The scent of roasted chestnuts filled the air as the two exchanged words in a language older than any treaties. "The West fears you, but they do not know what to make of us," the diplomat murmured, leaning forward. "But perhaps the time has come for your empire to make them see you in a new light. You must move quietly, like the tide, and strike only when the time is right." The conversations, once innocent enough on the surface, carried a much deeper meaning. The Ottoman emissary would gather not only political secrets, but whispers of alliances, of vulnerabilities in royal courts, of fractures between neighboring states. It wasn't enough to know the strength of the enemy, it was equally important to understand their weaknesses, their desires, their fears. The true power of diplomacy lay in knowing when to act and when to wait. But the Ottomans were not the only ones playing this game. Their enemies, too, had spies among them, hidden in plain sight. France, Austria, the small city-states of Italy all had their own shadowy figures, slipping in and out of the courts, whispering and listening, gathering what they could. And the Sultan knew that in this tangled web of alliances, nothing was ever as it seemed. Every new ally might be a double agent, every friendly gesture possibly a trap. There were other missions too, more direct, more perilous. There were moments when the empire's reach extended far beyond the smooth-talking diplomats. Sometimes it was a letter, sealed in black wax, carried by a swift rider across mountains and seas. The letter's contents were simple but dangerous. Orders for action, clear and decisive. A well-placed assassin or a bribe to a trusted royal might shift the tides in the Ottomans' favor. It was the dark art of influence, and it could alter the fate of entire kingdoms without a single shot being fired. Yet, despite all the cloak and dagger games, the heart of Ottoman diplomacy was rooted in something far more complex. It was about relationships, human connections woven over years, sometimes decades. A powerful ambassador could be as valuable as 1,000 soldiers. The Sultan's most trusted diplomats had the ability to turn a kingdom's desire into a weapon for the empire, manipulating situations without ever stepping onto a battlefield. They moved through the courts of Europe like dancers on a stage, each step calculated, each gesture a deliberate act of persuasion. One such diplomat, Mehmed Pasha, had earned his place in the Sultan's inner circle with his ability to manipulate not just foreign governments, but the very hearts of the people he encountered. His voice was soft but commanding, his eyes sharp as a hawk's, and his words always measured, never rushed. In Venice, he would sway the fragile trust of the Doge. In Austria, he would twist the loyalties of the nobles. And in France, he would flirt with intrigue at the royal court, all the while gathering information, assessing risks, and more importantly, ensuring that the Ottomans would never be caught off guard. But as these shadowy figures weaved their webs, there was always the lingering question, could they truly influence the course of history from behind the scenes? Or was there a point when the world would no longer bend to the will of whispers and secrets? For every advantage gained through espionage, there was an equal risk of discovery, of a mistake made in the dark that could lead to ruin. As the diplomat's missions continued, as his steps left traces across Europe, one thing became clear: the Ottomans, though they had suffered in Vienna, were far from defeated. The empire's eyes were open, its mind sharp. But what would become of these covert operations? Would the web they wove lead them to a new alliance? Or would the secrets they uncovered, the plans they set into motion, only bring them closer to the fire? The answers to these questions would take time to unfold, and only the passing of years would reveal the consequences of these hidden deeds. In the depths of night, when the stars flickered dimly in the sky above the Bosphorus, a quiet storm was brewing. It wasn't a tempest of wind or rain, but a storm of whispers, of subtle movements made in the shadows, an intricate web of manipulation and subterfuge spun by hands unseen. The great Ottoman Empire, ever the master of both overt might and covert influence, was preparing to wage a different kind of war. A shadow war, far from the battlefields of Europe, where armies clashed with the roar of cannons. This war was fought in the silence between alliances, in the fissures that could be pried open in the hearts of men. It was a war fought not with swords, but with the quiet stirring of rebellion and the fracturing of alliances that once seemed unbreakable. The echoes of defeat still reverberated from the disastrous Siege of Vienna. The dust had barely settled, but in Istanbul, the great palace was already a hive of activity. The divan, the council of the Sultan's closest advisors, was abuzz with talk of recovery, but recovery meant something more than just rebuilding what had been lost. It meant securing the empire's future by dismantling the fragile unity of its enemies, by sowing division where there was once strength. The Sultan, ever the tactician, knew that a war could be fought without ever setting foot on a battlefield. This was the art of the shadow war, a war of whispers, of turning neighbor against neighbor, of bringing old allies to their knees without a single shot being fired. The seeds of this war were planted in the farthest reaches of the empire, in lands where the Ottoman presence was felt but not always loved. Among the unruly provinces, the Sultan's reach was often tenuous, and unrest was a constant undercurrent. And so, the empire began its work in earnest. It sought out those who were dissatisfied, those who harbored old grudges or aspirations of independence. It wasn't just the common people who were stirred, it was the rulers, the local nobles, who found themselves at odds with their own monarchs, struggling under the weight of foreign influence and their own ambitions. One such noble, a man named Ivan, found himself at the center of a growing discontent. His land, rich in resources and strategically located, had been under the sway of the Habsburgs for many years. But his loyalty was as fragile as the peace that held it together. One evening, as the cold winds swept through the halls of his castle in the Carpathian Mountains, Ivan received a visitor, a man cloaked in mystery, his face shadowed, his words sharp. This man was no diplomat, no mere envoy. He was a shadow player, a representative of the Sultan, sent to find those willing to listen to promises of power and protection. "Your strength," the man said, his voice low, "is not in your obedience to Vienna, but in the loyalty you can find in your people. The empire offers you more than your current masters ever could. You know the Habsburgs are weak. Divide their influence and you will see your power grow." Ivan's mind raced. The proposition was dangerous, but it was also tempting. The empire promised him riches, autonomy, and a return to the glory of his ancestors. There was no love lost between Ivan and the Austrians, and as the man in the shadows spoke, Ivan felt the flicker of a thought, a seed beginning to sprout. He could ignite a rebellion. He could fracture the Habsburgs' power and in turn gain a foothold in a shifting world. So the first embers were lit. Ivan, emboldened by the Ottomans' promises, began to reach out to others in his region, whispering about the potential of a new order, about the strength of the Ottoman Empire and how it could reshape the future of their lands. These whispered promises fell on eager ears, and soon enough, a network of rebels began to form in the shadows, drawn to the prospect of liberation from foreign rule. But the Ottomans were not only playing this game in the wild frontiers of Europe. Their gaze was firmly fixed on the old alliances, the ones that had seemed so unbreakable in the past. They knew that even the most steadfast alliances could be fractured if only the right pressures were applied. And so, they began to chip away at the foundations of the great powers, prying at the cracks that had long existed but were never quite visible. Across the European continent there were murmurs in royal courts, faint rumors of betrayal, of deals struck in secret. The once strong alliance between the Habsburgs and the Polish crown, for example, had begun to show signs of strain. The Poles, ever cautious in their dealings, began to grow uneasy with the Habsburgs' increasing demands for support against the Ottomans. Some whispered that the Sultan's influence had already begun to find a foothold among certain factions in the Polish nobility, offering promises of protection and prosperity in exchange for loyalty. It wasn't just nobles that the Ottomans targeted. They understood the power of public sentiment, of stirring the hearts of the common people who had long been oppressed by their rulers. Propaganda, too, became a weapon, a subtle but effective one. Ottoman emissaries would slip into towns and villages, disguised as traders or travelers, spreading tales of the empire's greatness, painting vivid pictures of a world where the Ottomans were not invaders, but liberators. In the eyes of the peasantry, the Ottoman Empire became a symbol of hope, a way out of the grip of foreign oppression. And yet, not all was as simple as it seemed. The shadow war, though effective, was fraught with risks. As alliances splintered and rebellions stirred, the Ottoman Empire faced the delicate challenge of maintaining control over the very movements it had set in motion. In the great game of espionage and manipulation, no one could predict where the threads would lead. For every success, there was the possibility of failure. A failed assassination, a poorly timed rebellion, or an ally turned traitor. The Sultan, ever watchful, understood this. He knew that this shadow war was but the first step in a longer journey, one that would ultimately decide the future of the empire. As the whispers of rebellion grew louder, as the alliances between Europe's great powers began to crack, one thing became clear. The Ottomans were playing a dangerous game, but they were playing it well, and no one could yet say how it would end. For now, the shadows grew deeper and the game continued, each move carefully calculated, each rebellion a step toward an uncertain future. The world was changing, and the true battle was just beginning. The streets of Istanbul, bathed in the soft golden glow of the early morning sun, bustled with the rhythm of a city on the move. The air, still cool from the night, carried the scent of fresh bread and spices, blending with the salty tang of the Bosphorus. Along the ancient roads, merchants from every corner of the empire set up their stalls, displaying vibrant silks, intricately carved woodwork, and the gleam of precious metal. It was in these markets where cultures collided and mingled that the pulse of the Ottoman Empire could be truly felt. At the heart of the empire's strength, however, lay something far more tangible than the colorful fabrics and exotic perfumes. It was a force that had quietly fueled the Ottomans' rise to power: trade. For centuries, the empire had been the crossroads of civilizations, its vast expanse touching Europe, Asia, and Africa. Yet now, as the shadows of warfare and political instability loomed larger, a new strategy was taking shape. The empire needed more than just soldiers. It needed economic power. And the key to that power lay in two seemingly simple things: trade and coin. Sitting in the high chambers of the Topkapi Palace, the Sultan gazed out over the sprawling city below, his mind far from the grandeur of his palace and the whispers of court politics. His thoughts were consumed by something more pressing: how to secure the empire's future. The Habsburgs to the west, the Persians to the east, and the rising Russian threat, all of them posed a challenge, yes, but none were as immediate as the looming economic decline. The empire's coffers had begun to dwindle, the gold that once poured in from the lands of North Africa and the Levant no longer flowing as freely. The time had come to turn inward, to build up the wealth of the empire from the ground up, through trade and careful management of coin. In the shadows of the grand palaces and busy markets, a quiet revolution was underway. The Ottomans, who had long excelled at trade through conquest, were now looking at ways to control the flow of wealth through the city. A small group of trusted advisors, handpicked by the Sultan himself, had been tasked with a bold new plan to refine the empire's economic policies, focusing on securing new trade routes, controlling precious commodities, and strengthening the coinage that had once been the lifeblood of the empire. One man, a quiet figure known only as Ahmet, stood at the forefront of this economic maneuvering. Ahmet was not a general nor a noble, but rather a financier, a man with the mind of a merchant and the cunning of a diplomat. He understood that to strengthen the empire, the Ottomans had to become masters of the trade routes, not just the land they conquered. His plan was simple, yet revolutionary: strengthen the empire's internal markets, encourage local production, and create an empire-wide system of coinage that would circulate seamlessly across the vast territories. If the empire could control its currency and bolster its local industries, it could weather the storm of foreign influences and declining resources. Ahmet began his work with the currency. The Ottomans had long been known for their coinage, their gold and silver pieces carrying the weight of empire across continents. But now their currency had begun to lose value, undermined by inflation and the influx of foreign coins flooding the markets. Ahmet's first task was to establish a unified, stable coinage, one that could be relied upon not only by the empire's rulers, but also by its people. He set out to mint new coins that would be of a purer quality, stamped with the Sultan's seal, and most importantly, accepted universally throughout the empire. The impact was immediate. Traders, once wary of using Ottoman coins in their transactions, began to embrace the new currency. It was stronger, more stable, and above all, trusted. Merchants from Alexandria to Baghdad, from Belgrade to Mecca, found themselves using the new coins in trade, knowing that their value would hold firm no matter where they went. This in turn encouraged even more trade. Markets flourished, and the flow of goods within the empire surged. The Sultan's coffers, once empty, began to fill again, slowly but steadily. But Ahmet knew that currency alone would not be enough. The empire needed to expand its reach, to tap into new markets and new resources. With this in mind, he turned his attention to the trade routes that had for so long connected the East with the West. The Ottomans, through their vast network of allies, had access to silk, spices, and other precious goods, but they had to ensure that they controlled these trade routes, not just as a means of gathering wealth, but as a way to exert influence over the surrounding empires. Ahmet's next move was bold. He encouraged the construction of new roads, new caravanserais, those sprawling open-air inns where merchants could rest and trade along the Silk Road. These roads would not only facilitate the movement of goods, but they would serve as reminders of Ottoman power and influence. From the gates of Istanbul to the distant reaches of Persia, the empire's infrastructure was being slowly but surely transformed, ensuring that the flow of goods could move freely and efficiently under Ottoman control. Meanwhile, back in the bustling markets of Istanbul, the effects of Ahmet's policies were becoming increasingly evident. Merchants were no longer focused solely on goods from foreign lands. They were now turning inward, producing more of what the empire needed locally. The empire began to grow its own textiles, its own steel, and even its own luxury goods, which were once imported from distant lands. The Silk Road was no longer just a trade route, it was a lifeline, a symbol of the Ottomans' resurgence in a world that was rapidly changing. Yet even as the empire's economic power grew, there was an undercurrent of tension that threatened to unravel it all. The increasing strength of Ottoman trade and coinage was beginning to draw the attention of rivals. Europe's great powers, the Habsburgs and the Venetians in particular, began to take notice. Ahmet's careful maneuvers, once seen as a quiet revolution, were now becoming a challenge to the status quo. These European powers, threatened by the growing Ottoman influence, began to look for ways to disrupt the empire's trade networks. As the empire strengthened its hold on the purse strings of the world, there were still many dangers lurking on the horizon. Could the Ottomans, with all their economic power, defend the riches they had fought so hard to acquire? Or would the world come to see the empire as a growing threat to their own interests? Ahmet, standing on the balcony of the Topkapi Palace, looked out over the horizon. The future, like the markets of Istanbul, was filled with uncertainty. But one thing was clear: whatever challenges lay ahead, the empire had begun to change the rules of the game, and no matter what came next, the story of the Ottomans' rise through trade and coin was far from finished. The air in Istanbul felt heavy, as if the city itself had begun to hold its breath. It was the kind of stillness that followed a storm, the calm before a new, unseen one. Beneath the ancient walls of the Topkapi Palace, a secret plan had been set into motion. No one could have foreseen how this quiet, almost invisible strategy would ripple through time, shaping not just the final years of an empire, but its very survival in the face of overwhelming odds. History, it seems, is often made in the shadows. At the heart of this unseen plan lay an understanding of the inevitable change. The Ottoman Empire, which had once stretched from the sands of Africa to the windswept plains of Eastern Europe, was beginning to fracture. The signs were there for all to see: the decline of military might, the creeping influence of European powers, the unsettling shift in the balance of global trade. Yet, in the depths of the empire, far from the eyes of foreign diplomats or rival generals, a quiet rebellion was taking place, not of soldiers, but of ideas. The Sultan, now a figurehead more than a ruler, sat in his chambers contemplating the empire's future. The once mighty force that had swept across continents, forging a legacy of conquest and culture, now found itself caught between the old ways and the new world. His advisors, a mix of old men with gray beards and young strategists brimming with fresh ideas, gathered to discuss the fate of the empire. They were acutely aware that the old systems of power were crumbling. But there, in the heart of the palace, an unseen plan was being woven together. A plan not of conquest or war, but of survival. A plan that would change the course of the empire's destiny, even if it would remain largely unnoticed in the grand narrative of history. It began with the economy. While the rest of the world saw a crumbling empire, the Ottomans saw opportunity. The empire's leaders understood that in order to survive, they needed to adapt to the new global order. They began to focus on what they could control: trade, local production, and the intricate web of alliances that stretched from Persia to the shores of the Mediterranean. Ahmet, the financier who had quietly led the charge to stabilize the empire's currency, knew that the fate of the empire rested not in the hands of soldiers, but in the balance of coins, the exchange of goods, and the unspoken ties between far-flung markets. But this plan, while strategic, was not enough on its own. As the empire tightened its grip on its economic future, it began to look inward at its very foundation: the people. The Sultan's advisors knew that the true strength of an empire lay not in its army, but in the loyalty of its citizens. So, while the world focused on the decline of the Ottoman military, a new generation of Ottomans was quietly being cultivated. Intellectuals, merchants, diplomats, and thinkers. It was an invisible revolution, one that would see the empire hold on, not through the might of its weapons, but through the strength of its ideas. The shift was subtle at first. In the bustling streets of Istanbul, young men and women, once content to live their lives as their ancestors had, began to question: what if the future lay in knowledge, not conquest? What if survival meant adapting to the changing tides of the world rather than trying to fight against them? And so, the Ottoman intellectuals, some of whom would never see their names in history books, began to lay the groundwork for a more sustainable future. They focused on education, on building networks of trade, on creating alliances that transcended borders. Their work, though largely uncelebrated, would go on to be the unseen backbone of the empire's survival. As the years passed, the Ottoman Empire would endure, even as its enemies thought it was dying. The world around it shifted, empires rose and fell, new nations were born, and old powers vanished. Yet the Ottomans, through this quiet resilience, adapted. They did not survive because of brute strength, but because of a silent, unseen plan, a plan rooted in the careful management of resources, the cultivation of intellect, and the nurturing of subtle alliances that kept the empire tethered to the world around it. But even as the empire found ways to hold on, it was clear that time was running out. The world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined, and the Ottomans, despite their best efforts, were being pulled into a future they had not fully prepared for. The unseen plan, while brilliant in its execution, could not halt the inevitable tide of history. Yet there is something profound in this. The Ottomans survived not because they were destined to thrive forever, but because they understood the importance of adaptation. Their story is not one of glory, but of quiet survival, a testament to the power of resilience and the unseen efforts of those who refused to give up. Even as the empire faded into history, its legacy lived on in the quiet acts of those who sought to preserve its spirit, not through force or grandeur, but through subtle shifts in the world around them. And so as the sun sets over the Bosphorus, casting long shadows over the city, we are reminded that history is rarely shaped by the grand battles or famous names we know so well. It is often the unseen plan, the quiet strategizing, the whispered alliances, and the slow, steady work of those who remain in the background that shapes the future in ways we cannot always comprehend. The Ottoman Empire, despite its decline, did not disappear. It survived quietly, persistently, and with a legacy that echoes even today. As we close this chapter, we are left with a question. What unseen plans are unfolding in the shadows today? And how will they shape the future, long after we're gone? Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. The story of the Ottomans, in all its complexity, serves as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always a chance for survival, if we are willing to adapt, learn, and grow.